Chapter 8. Russian Roulette, July to September 1941. As September the 3rd and the second anniversary of the outbreak of World War II rapidly approached, the events of 1941 were gathering momentum. In Europe, the course of the conflict had veered dramatically as Adolf Hitler, after failing to invade the British Isles, turned his attention eastwards. On June 22, 1941, the Germans had invaded Russia as Hitler gave the order for Operation Barbarossa to commence. Anticipating a rapid victory by employing the blitzkrieg tactics that had seen Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries and France all fall to the Nazis, Hitler truly believed his troops would conquer the mighty Soviets before the onset of winter. It would prove to be a huge error of judgment, as the German Führer vastly underestimated the strength of his enemy. What's more, any hopes he had of his Japanese allies attacking Russia from the east as the Nazis advanced from the west were soon dashed as the Empire of the Rising Sun became rather more preoccupied with their ongoing war with China and awakening a sleeping giant of their own, namely the United States of America. The months of July, August and September 1941 were set to become very interesting indeed. And as the world watched and waited to see what would happen next, it wasn't just the Soviet Union preparing to play Russian roulette. For many people looking back at the history of World War II, the position of the Russians in the events as they unfolded is often tricky to understand. Even Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, described Russia as being a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. And as we look in depth at what was going on in July 41, stepping back further in time will certainly help us to understand matters more in context. Traditionally, as the 20th century dawned, the Russians had close ties with Great Britain, not least because the Tsar, Nicholas II, was married to Queen Victoria's granddaughter, Alexandra, and as another of Queen Victoria's grandchildren, the German Kaiser Wilhelm, threatened the peace of Europe, the Russians joined forces with the British when World War I began in 1914. But as the battlefields of Ypres and the Somme became soaked in the blood of the young men fighting in the trenches, the mighty Russian Empire was crumbling fast, and on the streets of Moscow, Russian blood was being spilled in equal measure. As World War I raged on, the Russian Revolution of 1917 saw the working classes rise up against their capitalist overlords, triggering a brutal civil war. With heavy losses to the Germans on the Eastern Front and deteriorating conditions on the home front, tensions ran high. The glittering decadence of the royal family was in stark contrast to the meagre existence of the peasant classes. And as Lenin came to fore as the Bolshevik leader, the Romanov dynasty was toppled as the Tsar and his family were captured and then executed. It was a desperate time for the people of Russia, who saw the rise of communism and the Red Army, named in honor of those whose blood had been shed in the war against capitalism. Then, when Lenin died in 1924, his place was taken by Joseph Stalin. Ironically, Lenin had warned against the threat that Stalin posed, but his wise words went unheeded. As far back as the 1920s, Winston Churchill could sum up a situation with the most telling of words, and a staunch opponent of communism, he declared that when it came to Lenin, for the people of Russia, their worst misfortune had been his birth, while the next worst was his death. It proved very much to be the case, as the Russians were left floundering without Lenin, and when Stalin came to power on human rights issues, there was little to choose between the new Soviet leader and Adolf Hitler. Stalin's Great Purge of the 1930s left the world and his own people in little doubt about what he was capable of. More accurately described as the Great Terror, Stalin launched a purge of the Communist Party to ensure he faced no opposition, just as Hitler was doing with his government in Nazi Germany. Those who had ever shown dissent were either sent to forced labor camps or executed, while millions of ethnic minorities were deported. Of the 5 first marshals of the Soviet Union, only 2 would survive the purge, Budyonny and Voroshilov, both of whom would have their part to play when the world went to war for a second time. With on average an estimate
Sample complete. Ready to continue?